The glass-walled restaurant went silent the moment the Mafia boss lifted his silver fork. Lee Sung-joon, sharp, lethal, and draped in the gold of an emperor, was seconds away from his first bite of victory when a scream shattered the air. "Don't eat that!" Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. There stood Louisa, her voluminous curls matted and her faded orange dress stained with the grime of the city streets. She clutched a burlap sack to her chest, her small frame trembling, but her eyes, wide and desperate, never left Sung-joon's. She lunged forward, nearly invading his space, her hand outstretched as if to physically strike the fork from his grip. "Please!" she gasped, her voice cracking with pure panic. "He wants you to sleep forever. Please don't eat it." Instantly, the men in the background reached for the heavy steel beneath their jackets. The air turned electric with the threat of death. But Sung-joon didn't flinch. He raised a single gold-chained hand, a gesture that froze his enforcers in place. "Why?" he asked, his voice a low, melodic blade. "How do you know what's in my food, little one?" Louisa's lip trembled as she looked into the face of the man the entire underworld feared. "Because," she whispered, "I saw the man with the scarred throat put the powder in it. I saw him from the shadows." A ripple of shock swept through the room. Sung-joon's grip tightened on the silver, his athletic frame going rigid. He knew that description, a man who was supposed to have been executed 5 years ago. Then, the little girl said the words that made even the cold-blooded Lee Sung-joon feel a chill of pure terror. "He tried to give it to me yesterday, too." In that heartbeat, the most powerful man in the city realized this wasn't just a hit. It was a message. And the only person who could help him survive the night was a 7-year-old girl the world had treated as invisible. "Stay with me until the end," because what Sung-joon discovered in that burlap sack would flip the entire underworld upside down and spark a war no one saw coming. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. The silence in the restaurant was no longer just a lack of sound. It was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. Sung-joon slowly lowered his fork, the silver clinking against the fine porcelain with a sound like a guillotine blade. He didn't look at the plate. He didn't look at the terrified girl. Instead, his gaze swept upward, tracing the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of his glass palace. From this height, the city looked like a circuit board of neon lights, and he was the current that powered it all. Everything about his environment was designed to reflect his absolute control, from the minimalist black marble floors to the razor-sharp precision of his own silhouette. He was a man who lived by the millimeter. His slicked-back hair was perfect, his athletic frame held with the tension of a coiled viper, and the intricate tattoos sprawling across his chest served as a map of every war he had won to sit at this table. "Woo Jin," Sung-joon said, his voice barely a breath. From the shadows behind his chair, a man stepped into the light. Woo Jin was Sung-joon's right hand, a mountain of a man in a charcoal suit that struggled to contain his sheer bulk. His face was a mask of scarred discipline, his eyes perpetually scanning for threats that hadn't even materialized yet. He was the shield that had kept Sung-joon alive through a decade of betrayal. "I'm here, boss," Woo Jin replied, his hand resting with practiced ease on the hilt of the weapon concealed at his hip. His eyes flickered to Louisa, then back to the doorway, his instincts already calculating the exit routes. "And Seo Young?" Sung-joon asked, still not moving. On the other side of the table, a younger man adjusted his glasses. Seo Young was the architect of the organization's digital soul. While Woo Jin was the iron, Seo Young was the silk, clean, fast, and terrifyingly intelligent. He didn't carry a gun. He carried the secrets of every politician and rival boss in the province. "The perimeter was secure 10 minutes ago," Seo Young whispered, his voice trembling slightly, not from fear of the girl, but from the sudden, jagged crack in their perfect evening. "The kitchen was vetted. The staff are all legacy families. This shouldn't be possible." Sung-joon finally turned his head. The movement was slow, predatory. He looked at Louisa, really looked at her, seeing the dirt on her orange dress against the pristine white of his tablecloth. In his world, everything was vetted, encrypted, and guarded. He had spent millions to ensure that death could never reach him unannounced. Yet here was a child who had bypassed his guards, his cameras, and his inner circle with nothing but a burlap sack and a scream. The gold chain around his neck felt suddenly heavy, a gilded leash. He looked at his two most loyal shadows. Wu Jin, the brawn. Xiao Yang, the brain. They were the pillars of his empire, but tonight those pillars felt like they were made of sand. 1 minute ago, Sung Jun said, his sharp features catching the neon glow from the window, I was the most powerful man in this city. Now, I am a man who almost died because he was too busy looking at his own reflection in the glass. He leaned forward, the motion causing Louisa to flinch. The glass palace felt less like a throne room and more like a cage. If what she said was true, the walls weren't protecting him. They were just making it easier for his enemies to watch him die. Wu Jin, clear the floor, he commanded. Xiao Yang, find out who let a ghost into my kitchen. The low hum of the restaurant's ventilation system was the only sound as Sung Jun's men cleared the perimeter, their footsteps muffled by the heavy velvet rugs. In the center of the vast, hollow luxury of the glass palace, Louisa felt smaller than she ever had under the concrete belly of the highway overpass. She clutched the burlap sack tighter, the rough fibers scraping against her knuckles. To Sung Jun, the sack was a mystery. To her, it was her entire world, containing a half-rusted canteen, a single spare sock, and a dented tin of crackers she'd found in a dumpster behind a bakery. Sung Jun's eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian, didn't leave her face. He was looking at her the way people usually didn't. On the streets, Louisa was a ghost. She was the shadow that slipped between the legs of commuters, the smudge of orange moving past tinted limousine windows, the silence that sat in the corners of alleyways, while men in expensive suits traded envelopes of cash. She was used to being invisible, and that invisibility had been her only protection until now. You said you saw him yesterday, Sung Jun prompted, his voice surprisingly gentle, though it still carried the resonance of authority. Under the bridge? Louisa nodded, her voluminous curls bouncing slightly with the motion. The bridge near the old shipyard, she whispered. Nobody goes there. The lights are broken, and the police don't like the smell. She swallowed hard, remembering the man who had appeared out of the freezing rain. He hadn't looked like the other monsters of the city. He had moved with a grace that felt familiar, dressed in a long coat that cost more than a year of meals. But it was the scar, a jagged, silvery line that ran from his jaw down into the collar of his shirt, that had caught the light of her small, flickering candle. He smiled at me, Louisa continued, her voice trembling, but his eyes stayed cold, like the river in winter. He gave me a bowl of rice and meat. He said I looked hungry. She paused, her grip on the burlap sack whitening her fingernails. I was going to eat it. I was so hungry my stomach felt like it was biting itself. But then I saw him. He took a small glass bottle from his pocket. He didn't think I could see him because I was just a girl in the dark. He poured the powder in and stirred it with a silver spoon. He looked happy when he did it. Sung Jun's jaw tightened. He realized then that Louisa hadn't just stumbled upon a secret. She had lived through a dress rehearsal for his own execution. In the underworld, men spent millions on thermal sensors and encrypted comms, but they always forgot to look at the scavengers. The man with the scarred throat, the man Sung Jun had called Master, had made a fatal mistake. He had assumed that a child living in the dirt had no eyes, no voice, and no worth. Louisa leaned forward, the dirt on her orange dress a stark contrast to the white linen of the table. He sat in a car across from the shipyard for hours tonight, she added, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. I watched him from behind the trash bins. He kept checking a watch that chimed every 30 minutes. He was waiting for the big boss to sit down. He said, "Your name, Mr. Sung Jun." He said tonight was the night the king would finally go to sleep. The invisible life Louisa led had turned her into the most effective surveillance asset in the city. She was the one witness who had seen the ghost return from the grave, simply because no one had bothered to tell her to leave. The air in the glass palace didn't just turn cold. It turned brittle, as if the very molecules of oxygen were crystallizing into ice. Sung Jun remained motionless, but his athletic frame seemed to contract, his muscles coiling beneath the intricate tattoos on his chest. Louisa's voice, small and weary, had just summoned a demon from a grave Sung-jun had personally helped dig 5 years ago. "Tell me about the scar again," Sung-jun commanded, his voice a low, vibrating hum that made the crystal glasses on the table chatter. Louisa reached up to her own throat, tracing a jagged, diagonal line from the base of her ear toward the hollow of her collarbone. "It's thick," she whispered, her eyes wide with the memory, "like a rope made of skin. When he speaks, it moves like it's trying to pull his head down. And he has a ring, Mr. Sung-jun, a heavy black one with a red stone." He kept turning it while he watched the restaurant. At the mention of the ring, Wu Jin let out a sharp, hissed breath. Seo Young's fingers froze over his tablet. The silence that followed was deafening. That ring, the dragon's eye, was supposed to have been crushed along with the man who wore it during the Great Purge. "Kong," Sung-jun breathed, the name tasting like ash. Images flashed through his mind, unbidden and searing. He remembered a younger version of himself, standing in a rain-slicked alleyway much like the ones Louisa lived in now. He remembered the towering, paternal shadow of Kong reaching down, not to strike him, but to clasp a heavy gold chain around his neck. "This is the weight of your future, Sung-jun," the master had told him. "Wear it until you are strong enough to break it." For a decade, Kong had been his god. He had taught Sung-jun how to read a man's pulse just by looking at his throat, how to hide a blade in a handshake, and how to build an empire on the bones of the ungrateful. When the coup happened 5 years ago, Sung-jun had been the one to lead the charge, believing he was finally breaking the chain. He had watched the flames consume the master's compound. He had seen the official reports of the charred remains. But the chain hadn't been broken. It had only been hidden. "The master didn't just come back," Sung-jun muttered, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the untouched, poisoned food. "He came back to finish the lesson." The irony was a jagged blade in his gut. The gold chain Kong had given him as a symbol of power had become a target, a beacon for a ghost seeking vengeance. Kong had once provided him with the tools to live. Now he was providing the tools for his end. The victory dinner was meant to be Sung-jun's final meal, a silver coffin gift-wrapped in saffron and silk. Sung-jun looked back at Louisa. She was the only reality in a room suddenly filled with ghosts. His most expensive security, his most loyal shadows, and his high-tech surveillance had all failed to detect a man who had been dead for half a decade. Kong had used his knowledge of Sung-jun's arrogance against him, knowing his former pupil would never look down at the invisible children of the street. "He's not just watching me," Sung-jun realized, his sharp features tightening into a mask of lethal intent. "He's waiting for the light to go out." The air in the restaurant didn't just feel cold now, it felt poisonous. Sung-jun looked at the plate of Wagyu beef and truffle, once a symbol of his triumph, now nothing more than a heap of expensive waste. His gaze drifted back to Louisa. He noticed the way she stared at the food, not with the longing of a hungry child, but with a deep, instinctive recoil. "You didn't eat it," Sung-jun said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Under the bridge, when he gave you the bowl. You didn't take a single bite." Louisa shook her head, her messy curls casting frantic shadows against the silk wallpaper. "I wanted to. My tummy was screaming. But I saw him drop the white powder in. And then I saw what he did next." She hugged the burlap sack to her chest, her knuckles turning the color of bone. "He didn't just leave. He sat on a crate and watched me. He waited for me to start. When I wouldn't, he got angry. Not shouting angry. Quiet angry. Like a snake." She swallowed, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. "He caught a stray dog, a little brown one that sleeps near my box. He threw a piece of the meat to it. Just one piece." Her voice broke, a small, jagged sob escaping. "The dog. It didn't even have time to yelp. It just fell over. His legs shook and then it went still." The man with the scar just smiled. He looked at his watch, wrote something in a little book, and looked at me. He said, "Don't worry, little bird. The king will eat far more than that tomorrow." A dark, visceral heat began to radiate from Sung-jun's chest, melting the icy composure he had maintained for years. He had spent his life in the company of monsters. He had ordered hits, broken lives, and burned legacies. But there was a professional coldness to his violence, a logic of business and survival. What Louisa was describing was something else. It was the clinical, detached cruelty of a man who viewed a starving child as nothing more than a biological timer. Kong hadn't just returned to reclaim his throne. He had become a scientist of suffering, using the most vulnerable soul in the city to calibrate the dosage of his vengeance. Sung Jun's hand, usually as steady as a surgeon's, tightened around the edge of the mahogany table until the wood groaned. He looked at Louisa, the smudges on her face, the faded orange dress that hung off her skeletal frame. She was the test subject. She was the expendable variable in Kang's equation. He used you, Sung Jun muttered, his sharp features twisting into a mask of pure, protective rage. He used a child to check his watch. For the first time in his career, the Mafia boss didn't feel the weight of his gold chain as a burden of power. He felt it as a weapon. His internal glass palace, the fortress of cold indifference he had built to survive the underworld, shattered. The man who had once been a hungry kid in these same gutters looked at the girl who had just saved him from a silver coffin, and he felt a spark of something he hadn't known he possessed. A father's fury. "Wu Jin," Sung Jun said, his voice sounding like grinding stone. "Find that dog. Find where she sleeps. And if there is a single trace of that bastard left in that shipyard, I want it brought to me." He stood up, the chair scraping back with a violent screech. He didn't look at the traitors in his circle or the neon city outside. He reached out, his tattooed hand hovering for a second before gently resting on Louisa's shoulder. "He won't use anyone else, Louisa," he promised. "Especially not you." The warmth of Sung Jun's hand remained on Louisa's shoulder for only a second before his touch retreated, replaced by a cold, clinical detachment that was far more terrifying. He straightened his black suit jacket, the silk sliding over his tattooed chest like the scales of a serpent. The protective fury hadn't vanished. It had simply been channeled into a laser-focused search for the rot within his own house. "The doors," Sung Jun murmured. With a synchronized click, the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room locked. The glass palace was no longer a sanctuary. It was an interrogation chamber. Sung Jun began to pace, his leather shoes clicking a rhythmic, predatory beat against the marble. He stopped behind Seo Young. The younger man was still staring at his tablet, his glasses reflecting the scrolling lines of code, but his pulse was visible, a frantic rhythmic throb in the hollow of his throat. "Seo Young," Sung Jun started, his voice deceptively light. "You built the steel curtain. You told me that not a single byte of data, not a single human soul, could enter this restaurant without your digital thumbprint. And yet, a ghost walked into my kitchen and seasoned my dinner with death." Seo Young didn't look up, but his fingers shook. "Boss, the logs, they haven't been tampered with. It's like he was never there. Or like he was already authorized to be there." The implication hung in the air like a poisoned mist. Sung Jun moved on, his shadow stretching long across the table toward the older advisor sitting in the corner. The man, known only as Kang Dae, sat motionless, his face obscured by the brim of a vintage felt hat. He had been a fixture of the organization since the days of the old master. He was the bridge between the past and the present. "And you, uncle?" Sung Jun said, leaning over the table until his gold chain dangled inches from the old man's weathered hands. "You were the one who confirmed Kang's death 5 years ago. You provided the dental records. You signed the affidavit for the crematorium. Tell me, did the ashes reform into a man, or was the urn filled with sand from the beginning?" Kang Dae slowly tilted his head up. His eyes, behind thick glasses, were milky and unreadable. "Vengeance is a patient gardener, Sung Jun. Sometimes we see what we want to see because the truth is too heavy to carry." "A poetic answer for a man who might be holding the shovel," Sung Jun hissed. He looked between them, the digital genius and the ancient advisor. One possessed the keys to the locks, the other the keys to the history. Both had the means to let a ghost through the gates. Behind them stood the wall of bodyguards, their expressions masked by sunglasses, their loyalty bought with blood and bullion. But as Sung Jun scanned their rigid postures, he realized the terrifying truth. Loyalty in the underworld was merely a contract waiting for a higher bidder. He looked back at the poison plate. To kill a king, you didn't need an army. You only needed one person to look the other way for 5 seconds. Kong knew this. He had taught Sung Jun that the closest blade is the one you never see coming. One of you open the door, Sung Jun said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. One of you told him exactly when I would lift my fork. I can smell the betrayal in this room. It smells like old sweat and new money. He turned to Louisa, who was watching the exchange with the wide, analytical eyes of a scavenger who knew when the wolves were about to turn on each other. Louisa, he said softly, look at them, look at their hands. Which one of these men smells like the man from the bridge? The air in the room didn't just thicken. It curdled. Louisa's eyes darted from the digital architect to the silent advisor. But before she could speak, a shadow detached itself from the heavy velvet curtains near the kitchen service entrance, and stepped into the light. She was the only woman in Sung Jun's inner sanctum, a sharp-featured operative in a tailored white suit that cut a striking contrast against the sea of black tuxedos. She was the cleaner, the one who handled the fallout when the blood became too much for the public eye. Usually, she was a ghost, efficient and invisible, but tonight, her movements were frantic, almost maternal. Sung Jun, this is madness, Ange said, her voice smooth but strained. The child is traumatized. She's babbling about ghosts and poison because she's starving. Let me take her. I'll get her cleaned up, fed, and moved to a safe house while you deal with this. She reached for Louisa's arm, her movements practiced and soft. Louisa flinched, pulling the burlap sack tighter against her chest, but Ange's grip was firm. She began to guide the girl toward the back exit, away from the interrogation and the cold, accusing eyes of the men in the room. She's a distraction, Ange continued, not looking back. Kong is dead. We all saw the bones. Don't let a scavenger's nightmare tear your house apart. Sung Jun stood perfectly still, watching the way Ange's hand rested on Louisa's shoulder. It looked like a gesture of protection, but through the neon noir haze of his suspicion, it looked more like an arrest. He noticed something then, a small rhythmic tick in Ange's left hand. She was rubbing her thumb against her index finger, a nervous habit he had seen 1,000 times before. It was a habit she had picked up from the master. Ange, Sung Jun called out, the name hitting the room like a gunshot. She stopped, her back still to him. Louisa looked over her shoulder, her eyes wide with a renewed sense of terror. You were the one who vetted the kitchen staff tonight, weren't you? Sung Jun asked, his voice dropping into that low, melodic blade that signaled a kill. You were the one who insisted we celebrate here, at the corner of 5th and Moroni, a place with a clear line of sight from the shipyard. Ange didn't turn around. I chose it for its security, Sung Jun. You know that. I know that Kong taught us both how to hide in plain sight, Sung Jun replied, his leather shoes clicking against the marble as he closed the distance. And I know that he always kept a woman in the wings, someone the others would never suspect because she was too busy cleaning up their messes. He reached out, his tattooed hand grabbing Ange's wrist, forcing her to let go of Louisa. As he pulled her hand back, the sleeve of her white blazer shifted, revealing a small, fresh burn mark on the inside of her forearm, the mark of the dragon's disciples. A cult of loyalty Kong had started decades ago. You didn't want to save her, Ange, Sung Jun hissed, his sharp features inches from hers. You wanted to silence her, because she saw the one thing you couldn't hide, the face of the man who still owns your soul. Louisa stumbled back, the burlap sack hitting the floor with a heavy thud. The secret was out. The rot wasn't just in the shadows. It was standing right next to him. The revelation of the burn mark on Ange's wrist acted like a tripwire, snapping the remaining tension in the room into a state of high-alert combat readiness. As Sung Jun maintained his crushing grip on her arm, the silent wall of bodyguards in the background finally broke their statuesque composure. They didn't move toward Sung Jun to assist him. Instead, they began to step outward, forming a tight, outward-facing ring that enclosed the table, the boss, and the girl. It was a maneuver perfected for active shooter scenarios, but as the heavy curtains were drawn shut by men in sunglasses and the electronic locks on the glass palace hissed into a permanent seal, Sung Jun realized the formation was inverted. They weren't keeping the world out. They were keeping him in. The restaurant, once a shimmering monument to his ego, had transformed into a windowless fortress, a high-end tomb. The victory dinner hadn't just been a celebratory meal. It was a carefully choreographed stage play. Every toast, every clink of expensive wine, and every minute he spent savoring the saffron risotto had been a countdown. "The schedule," Sung Jun whispered, his eyes darting to the wall clock. Phase 2. He remembered Luisa's description of the man on the bridge checking his watch every 30 minutes. He looked at his own gold-plated timepiece. It was 9 p.m. exactly, the very moment he was supposed to have succumbed to the poison. "You didn't just let him in, Ange," Sung Jun said, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating bass. "You turned my own security into his firing squad." Ange didn't struggle against his grip. A cold, hollow smile spread across her face, the look of a true believer who knew the end was already written. "The master doesn't like loose ends, Sung Jun. He gave you this empire to see if you were worthy. You failed the moment you thought you were the one holding the leash." Luisa shrunk back against the mahogany table, the burlap sack clutched to her chest like a shield. She looked at the ring of suited men, their hands now visibly hovering over the stocks of submachine guns concealed beneath their jackets. Even Wu Jin, the mountain of a man who had stood at Sung Jun's right hand for a decade, remained eerily still, his eyes fixed on a point just above Sung Jun's head. The betrayal was total. The glass palace was a cage of his own making, filled with men who had transitioned from his protectors to his executioners the moment the clock struck 9. Sung Jun felt the weight of the gold chain around his neck. For years, he had believed it was a symbol of his ascent. Now, looking at the silent, rigid wall of men surrounding him, he realized it was a gilded target. Kong hadn't just come back to kill him. He had come back to show Sung Jun that everything he owned, the loyalty, the luxury, the life, was still on loan from the man who had taught him how to breathe. He was the king of a kingdom that had already surrendered. "Luisa," Sung Jun said, not breaking eye contact with the traitors. "Stay behind me. If the world wants to see a king fall, we're going to make them watch the whole palace burn first." The electronic locks hummed with a finality that felt like a tomb being sealed. Surrounded by a wall of men whose loyalty had evaporated the moment the clock struck 9, Sung Jun looked at the untouched plate of poison, and then at the small, trembling girl at his side. The high-tech cameras, the steel curtain of digital security, and the army of suited enforcers had all been a lie. He had built a fortress of glass, and as he looked into the unreadable eyes of Wu Jin and the cold, triumphant smile of Ange, he realized he was the only person in the room who had actually been blind. He wasn't a king. He was a target. The victory dinner was a funeral he had paid for himself. Every gold-plated detail of his life had been curated by Kong, the master who had never truly left the shadows. The weight of the world he had fought so hard to conquer suddenly felt like an anchor dragging him into the abyss. "Luisa," Sung Jun said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly resonance that cut through the stifling tension of the room. The girl looked up, her knuckles white as she clutched the rough burlap sack. Her eyes, filled with the wisdom of someone who had lived 1,000 lives in the gutters, searched his face. She didn't see the Mafia boss or the Neon Noir legend. She saw a man who was finally, for the first time, looking at the truth. Sung Jun reached up to his neck. His fingers, steady despite the guns leveled at his chest, unclasped the heavy gold chain, the symbol of his power, the gift from the master that had become a leash. The gold glinted under the crystal chandeliers, a shimmering fragment of the empire he was now prepared to burn. He knelt. The movement was slow, deliberate, and a total surrender of his ego. For the first time in his career, Lee Sung-jun lowered himself to the level of the invisible. "This chain, it was supposed to mean I was a king," he whispered, his sharp features softening into something human. He took Luisa's small, dirt-stained hand and pressed the heavy gold into her palm. It looked impossibly large and bright against her faded orange dress. But it was just a chain. I was so busy looking at the gold that I didn't see the man who was holding the other end. Luisa stared at the metal, then back at him. The burlap sack slipped slightly from her grip. "If we get out of here tonight, Luisa," Sung Jun said, his tattooed hand resting gently over her fingers, "you are never going to carry that sack again. You will never have to hide in the shadows to see the truth. You won't be a test subject for anyone. Do you hear me? Louisa nodded, a single tear carving a clean path through the smudge on her cheek. By giving her the chain, Sung Jun wasn't just giving her wealth. He was surrendering the throne that had almost cost him his soul. He was trading his crown for a conscience. He stood up, turning back to the ring of traitors. He no longer wore the gold, but he had never looked more dangerous. The glass palace was still a cage, but the man inside it was no longer a prisoner of his own arrogance. He was a man with a purpose that went far beyond blood and business. The meal is over, Sung Jun said, his voice echoing against the silent wall of men. Now, let's see who's actually ready to die for a ghost. The glass palace didn't shatter with a roar. It fell with the cold, clinical precision of a system reboot. As Sung Jun stood over the untouched, poisoned meal, his gaze didn't linger on the traitors. He didn't need to. The moment he had pressed that gold chain into Louisa's hand, the old Lee Sung Jun, the one who ruled through fear and expensive isolation, had died. In his place stood a man who had finally seen through the neon haze of his own reflection. Wu Jin, Sung Jun said, his voice slicing through the heavy silence like a razor. The secondary fleet. Now, the mountain of a man hesitated for a heartbeat. His eyes flicking from the cold, expectant smile of Ange to the small girl in the tattered orange dress. The power dynamic in the room shifted visibly. Loyalty in the underworld was a fickle beast, but Sung Jun's sudden, quiet transformation, from a desperate king to a focused guardian, was a force of nature. Wu Jin bowed his head, the rigid, silent wall of guards parting not out of fear, but out of a renewed, grim respect. They moved through the service exit, bypassing the main floor where the ghosts of the past were still waiting for a corpse. Outside, the night air was sharp and smelled of incoming rain. A fleet of black sedans sat idling, their exhaust plumes curling into the dark like cold breath. Sung Jun didn't climb into the lead car. He opened the door of the reinforced center vehicle himself, ushering Louisa inside. She still clutched the burlap sack in one hand and the heavy gold chain in the other, her wide eyes reflecting the flashing lights of the city she had only ever seen from the gutters. For the first time, she wasn't watching the world from behind a trash bin. She was the heartbeat of the operation. "Where are we going?" she whispered as the leather seats hissed under her weight. "To find the man who thinks you're invisible," Sung Jun replied, sliding in beside her. He didn't look at his reflection in the tinted window. He looked at her. The fleet pulled away from the curb in a synchronized blur of black steel. As they sped toward the shipyard, the city lights streaking past like tracers, Sung Jun felt a weight lift from his shoulders that the gold chain had never been able to balance. For years, his only stake in this game had been territory and digits in a Swiss account, things that could be stolen, burned, or poisoned. Now, he had something far more dangerous to his enemies. He had a purpose. He watched Louisa's small silhouette against the passing neon. She was the witness, the survivor, and now, the only reason he had left to keep his heart beating. The hunt for Kong wasn't just about reclaiming a throne or settling a blood debt anymore. It was about ensuring that the girl in the orange dress never had to scream, "Don't eat that," to another human being again. The king was gone. The protector had arrived. And as the cars screamed toward the dark docks of Pier 17, the underworld was about to learn that a man with nothing to lose is terrifying, but a man with something to protect is invincible. The new reign had begun, and it wouldn't be written in gold, but in the fierce, uncompromising light of the truth. We have come to the end of this story. Let us know in the comments what you loved about this story, and do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the Cinem Corner channel. Thanks for watching. Sit back, relax, and let me tell you another story.